Jackson, Tennessee, and this is our Practicing Our Faith series. So today I want us to talk about a spiritual practice that is very difficult for many of us, and that is keeping silence. This is one of those practices that sounds easy, but many of us struggle with it. We're not comfortable with silence. But I think it's something that's important for us to do, mainly because, the way that we most often interact with God is through prayer. Uh, but for many of us, when we come to God in prayer, we do all the talking. We kind of give God our laundry list, which God wants us to do. God wants us to come with all of our problems and needs and thoughts and all of that, and give all that over to God. But often we kind of stop there and we don't make space to hear what God is saying in the conversation. So silence gives us a way of making room for God's voice and hearing what God has to say to us. But again, this is a very difficult practice. A lot of us rush to fill our days with sound. Either we feel like we need to be talking, or we need to have the television on, or the radio, or whatever it is, we fill our day with sound. And I think it's important for us to, just ask ourselves, what voices are filling our days? What are the sounds? What are the things that we're hearing? What is feeding us? Because that's going to impact what goes on inside us, and it's going to impact, what comes out of us, what the words that we say to others. So if we're only hearing, voices from the television, or, our own voice, then what comes from us is going to be not always helpful. So we need to make room to hear what God is saying to us, so that can start to impact what's going on inside us, and also what we project. I think it's also important to just acknowledge that one of the reasons that we tend to have trouble with silence is when we're silent, oftentimes the first voice that we hear is the voice of our own internal critic. So the moment we're silent, we start criticizing ourselves. We start thinking like, oh, I messed that up, or I didn't do a good job on that, or, I never get it right, or whatever it is. That's often the voice that fills the void. And that is not the point in this spiritual practice. That voice isn't helpful. What we're trying, and that voice, by the way, often can crowd out God's voice. So, we're trying to put that aside and just listen for what God is saying to us. So there are many ways of practicing silence, and I'll name a few. You may have other ideas, whatever works for you. These are just ideas. So the first one is often used in meditation practices, and that is to focus on our breath. So when we observe silence, we focus on our breath. And so it's like taking in a deep breath, and you can even count it out, count to 5 or 6 slowly as you're breathing in, and then exhale slowly, and maybe even count that out. So you're focusing on the breath, and it gives you a focal point. And then as your mind starts to wander, which it inevitably will, we're human, you can acknowledge the thought that has come to you, but don't pass judgment on it. Don't say, oh, I'm not doing this right, or I'm not supposed to be thinking about that. Just acknowledge that the thought came, and then let it go without judgment, and come back to the breath. So it's coming back to a focal point and helping us to remember, why we're observing silence is to listen for God. Another way you might do this is actually in your car when you're driving somewhere. That's a great time to observe silence. Um, I had a friend who I worked with at the hospital when I was working as a chaplain, and she was also a chaplain. We worked in this trauma center together. And she told me that on her commute to and from work, she didn't turn on the radio, she didn't listen to music or podcasts or anything else. She just rode to and from work in silence. Because she knew that as she walked into the trauma center, she was going to be met with chaos and craziness and the flood of emotions that comes when you're meeting with families and patients and the medical teams and all that. And so um, having that time of silence just helped her center and be prepared for that chaos. And then after she left all the chaos of the trauma center on her way back home, she would also stay in silence to help sort of detox from that, to help process it. And it gave her space to hear what God was saying, the way that God was going to sustain her as she went in to the hospital, and then also listening for God's voice and helping to process all the things she had seen during her shift. So that's also an idea. And then the last one I'll mention is about finding ways to do this with children, because I know that as a parent of two small kids, um, when you have children, silence is difficult. There's not a lot of silence in my house. I have two very talkative kids, and it's just, kind of just constant noise. And it can be really hard as a parent to get time away from that. I mean, I know, we think, okay, I'll observe some silence while they're napping, and then they never nap. Or, I'll do it when they go to sleep, and then as soon as they go to sleep, we're exhausted and we fall asleep. So one way of observing silence when you have small children is trying to get them involved in it. And I know it's easier said than done, but you can make sort of a game out of it. See who can hold silence the longest, or ask them. When we're silent, what do we hear that we normally wouldn't hear? Are there sounds that come to us that we normally just talk over, or don't notice when we're being busy and chattering and all that kind of stuff? Actually, a good friend of mine has a meditation for teens and children that teaches to listen. So I'll try to link to that in the comments below if you want to check it out. It's actually really neat, and I mean, I'm not a child or a teenager, but I really enjoyed it, so I'll link to that. But the main idea, the main point is just however you observe silence, is to create space to listen for God's voice, to turn off, the noise and the chatter that normally fills our days, and just make space to see what God has to say to us. It's a chance to be still and know that God is God. So I hope that you find time this week to observe silence, to listen for God's voice, and to see what words God has for you, especially during this unprecedented time, this uncharted time. What is God saying to you right now? Thanks be to God.